The Athletic.
The race is on, and Charles Leclerc put his Monaco Grand Prix curse to bed with a lights-to-flag victory on his home streets. But what made Ferrari and McLaren so good, and Red Bull, by its standards, so bad? I'm Edd Straw, and joining us to tell all are Scott Mitchell-Malm, Mark Hughes and Josh Suttill. Well, Scott, we'll come to you first. A home win at Monaco. Well, that's got to be a great race to be at.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating weekend watching kind of the build-up to this. Leclerc's looked absolutely on it from the word go. So there's always a sense of anticipation and expectation for Charles to achieve something here, especially as even in Ferrari's leaner years, the car's been quite competitive on these streets. And it's a home race that obviously he absolutely loves, he excels at, but he's never had the luck before. And then as this weekend kind of went on, you just sort of thought, it feels like it's coming together, but that twisted part of you is just waiting to see kind of what trips him up next. And I have to say, like, the reaction to him winning was amazing. I'm really happy for him. The various boats in the harbour were going mad on the last lap or so, sounding their horns. It drowned out absolutely everything else over the last sort of 90 seconds of Charles' race. But yeah, it was an amazing atmosphere.
Yeah, it's got to be something pretty special. And Mark Hughes, obviously, I don't think you quite go back to Louis Chiron's win there. So first home victory at Monaco that you've witnessed.
It is, indeed, yeah. And I'm just trying to think, was it the nearest I've seen? Has there been a Frenchman won at Monaco? I was...
Olivier Beretta finished seventh in 94. I think he was seventh off the top of my head.
Olivier Panis won in 96, but I wasn't here. So yeah, it was a lovely fairy story, and it's taken a few years to come together, but it finally did today.
Absolutely. And Josh Suttill, as we talked about on the podcast before Monaco, it's your first trip to Monaco. So what did you make of it? Did you find it lived up to expectations? Did you enjoy the madness of the whole place?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been great to witness it. It's been a real privilege to see it all in reality. It's obviously very different from years of watching it on the TV. It's quite the experience, and to be honest, I've enjoyed pretty much everything up until the race. I think you get kind of the best and the worst of Monaco, and I think the best is basically everything up to the race, and yeah, some of the worst, which we'll, I'm sure, come on to, is certain aspects of the race.
Well, there's plenty to talk about when it comes to this one. So, Mark, we'll go to you now. A bit of a challenge for you, because this was the first time in World Championship history the top 10 all finished where they started, a stat I saw tweeted by Sean Kelly there. But can you explain how the Monaco Grand Prix played out?
I hadn't realised that until I read the stat. It was the competitive order was set in place in qualifying, and it was the track at which the Red Bull finally came unstuck, of course, and its limitations, which Max Verstappen has said has been there for the last, since 2022, for the first time, really bit. Well, first time since Singapore 23, actually, the Singapore last year, really bit. Quite a similar set of problems to that it suffered at Singapore, and I think the difference this year is that McLaren and Ferrari are close enough that they can punish it when it's out of its sweet spot, and so we've seen that a little bit. We saw that a little bit in Melbourne, but we saw it more emphatically here, and I think it just opens a little bit of a crack of sunlight that we may actually have a less one-dimensional Red Bull season than we've had in the last couple of years.
Yeah, the usual thing, the more cars at the front battling the better. And it was all about Ferraris and McLarens, and obviously it was just Leclerc, Piastri, Sainz, Norris pretty much all the way through. Ferrari doing a good job to make sure that there wasn't quite that pit stop gap to Russell for Norris to have a go at coming back against Sainz, although, as we saw, passing was hardly easy there. Before we get into Leclerc's win, which is obviously the big story, it's probably worth, Mark, delving a little bit more into the Red Bull struggles, because obviously Max Verstappen said they'd been found out, and he sounded quite frustrated that these problems were still being carried by the team. So what more meat can you put on that particular bone?
Well, basically the rear suspension is not compliant in roll. It's very, very stiff laterally, believed to be quite compliant vertically. So it's got lots of travel, which is part of what allows Red Bull to run this very sympathetic underbody design with quite a high ceiling, which allows it at a point where other cars might start to bounce. The suspension on this one just has enough travel to allow it to take the excess load on board without triggering the bouncing. But we found out that the hard limit you come up against there eventually is mechanical bouncing, because if you're limiting the car and roll, but you're having to go to a high ride height because of the bumps of the circuit, the nature of the circuit, it seems to get to a place where it can no longer have enough compliance over when the camber of the road changes, or when you have to take a sudden curb or a bump, and that load gets transferred straight through to the chassis rather than gets soaked up by the suspension. And that's Max said that it's been like that all the time for the last few years. And I think it's quite interesting that something that Adrian Newey said at the launch of the car, which made me wonder. He said, "No, I'm pretty sure that this car will top out quite early in terms of development, and that others still have development potential in them." He said, "I think others probably got more development potential left than us." And I think that's probably what he's thinking of. He's probably thinking, yeah, as soon as the others work out their own way of doing it, we're going to be exposed on particular types of track. And Singapore last year gave them the clue, and this was confirmation of it. It's part of the concept of the car. I think it's just that's how it is. It's part of what makes it so good globally over the full range of circuits. But it was disguised before, let's say.
Verstappen was very good at describing it, I thought, after qualifying. Like, he has his moments when the very, very few times he doesn't make it into the top three and therefore ends up in the FIA press conference. He slums it with us in the mix zone after qualifying. And in those moments, especially when he's got something to say, it's very illuminating. I think he stuck around for almost 8 minutes afterwards, which is, by mix zone standards, is probably 2.5 times the driver average. So he was happy to take all questions on this, and you could tell it bothered him. I feel like it almost spoke to the single-mindedness of Verstappen in terms of he wants to win every single race and wants every opportunity to be victorious, because it's almost like he doesn't care that by having this kind of problem in Monaco, he's then able to fight for wins at every other circuit, because he wants this to be fixed. And the sort of implication from Christian Horner over the weekend was basically that if you fixed it to be optimal here, you wouldn't have all that goodness on the other tracks. And Max isn't worried about that in this moment, because now he needs it. He needs it now.
Yeah, that's not his problem. It shouldn't be his problem.
I think it is worth noting, though, as well, because generally, Max Verstappen maximises everything in the car. And this car was really difficult to drive, but had he not had that moment at Sandoval, which was down to the characteristics of the car on his last Q3 lap, he'd have qualified second, third, probably. And rather than finishing sixth in the race, and of course he was just sat between the two Mercedes all race, he'd have probably finished on the podium. So even on the worst possible day for Red Bull, the pace was in there to be probably on the podium, and that owes plenty to Verstappen's qualities. But we should note that the gap to Perez in Q1 was about 3.5 tenths, which is where Perez has quite often been in qualifying this season, but plenty of times that's been enough to be in a pretty good position. I'm sure we'll have some questions later on from the Race Members Club about Red Bull, but let's move on now to Leclerc. As I said, the first home victory since Louis Chiron in 1931, which is one of my favourite facts to mention. How big a deal was it really for Charles Leclerc? We talked about that Monaco curse and he'd been downplaying it, but this was a huge, huge deal for him, wasn't it?
Yeah, it is a big deal, and you could tell it meant a lot to him, and was it just feels like an unsatisfying cliche to say it's a weight off his shoulders, but there's an emotional baggage around this kind of thing. And Leclerc said in those final laps he was thinking about winning, and that emotion was becoming so powerful. He said like he couldn't see almost, and tearing up. So that's the kind of thing that we're talking about. And I remember saying to you, Mark, earlier in the weekend, to me, it's one of the things that made me think, like, surely something's going to go wrong this weekend is when there's so much hype or build-up or expectation on someone to win a home race, and that driver wants to win it so much, and everybody else wants them to win it so much, and their home fans want them to win it so much, that it can kind of collapse on itself because that weight of expectation is so great. And like the examples I was giving, like Rubens Barrichello in Brazil, for example, which just always felt like just one of those things is like, one way or another, this is doomed to never happen. And Jenson Button at Silverstone, and never quite coming together at the British Grand Prix, even in the Brawn year, and with McLaren. And when you think of the circumstances that Leclerc has had at Monaco, to have been on pole twice before in this race and still not managed to finish on the podium, I think, let alone win. Like that's the level of home curse that you were dealing with, and why there was this narrative about his home race curse and stuff. So to have finally banished that and to have done it in such emphatic fashion with the way that he was this weekend, like to my mind, there was no doubt he was going to be on pole position. He just looked absolutely at one with this second. I remember in FP3, I think it was 15-20 minutes to go of the session, he pumped in a lap that was like 6-7 tenths quicker than anything anyone else could do. And they basically spent the last 10-12 minutes or so just chipping away at it, getting closer and closer. And Leclerc was just kind of like, that's fine. Yeah,
I think that was his benchmark. Mentally he thought, that's sort of how it's going to feel, and he just built it from there. Really, he was so confident, and so just the car works so fluidly over the curbs as well, and so he was just really able to express himself, and it was fantastic to watch.
What was interesting is Carlos Sainz is pretty handy around the streets of Monaco, but he admitted after qualifying that Leclerc was just more confident. So very much this was just Leclerc at his absolutely flying best. And to me, it illustrates that point we make that sometimes people object to, but fundamentally when things are right, Leclerc is just that bit quicker than Carlos Sainz and is arguably the quickest guy on the grid, potentially.
Yeah, I think he is over one lap. We've said that plenty of times on this podcast. You mentioned earlier, Ed, that it was Josh's first trip to Monaco, which meant this weekend he also got his first trip trackside to see the cars up close. Were you there for Leclerc's benchmark lap in, because it was FP3 you went trackside, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Me and Mark went trackside, and the swimming pool section, you can see obviously the driver's commitment there. And I think quite early on in that session, earlier we were up Beau Rivage, Massenet, yeah. And we saw the commitment quite early on. I remember you pointing out that Charles was already so committed early on in an FP3 session. So yeah, you could see the commitment there, and you could also see where other cars were lacking. So yeah, it was quite a good visible demonstration. And yeah, you walked away from FP3 just feeling like it was inevitable that he was going to take pole position, and obviously he did. And actually in the end it was probably a lot closer than it had looked throughout some of practice. But obviously once he got that, it set it up very well for the race, and obviously he was able to convert it, and it felt almost like a first win, really, with the emotion. I can't really remember a race where a home victory has meant so much for quite a while. So yeah, it was a special one, and nice to see just 2 races on after Norris, a win that really, really means so much to the driver.
Ed, I know that you shared my absolute bafflement at this, but so you must be as relieved as I am that Leclerc is now off the ridiculous tally of 5 race wins in his F1 career. I know that 6 is hardly any better, but he's been stuck on 5 for just over 2 years now. It was just frankly absurd. So I hope he's not on 6 for the same amount of time.
Well, it's the moment we've all been waiting for, when he catches Riccardo Patrese on 6 wins. But the thing is that this is such a massive win because Monegasques are quite rare. There's not actually that many of them. There's, I don't know, something like 8,000 or 9,000 of them or something, actual true Monegasques. It's not just people who live in Monaco, but actual proper Monegasques. So it's a huge thing. And I think home wins are special, but I think a home Monaco Grand Prix win is such a rare thing. It's amazing there have been 2 of them, really. So yeah, just a massive story, and it must be great for just a great story for Monaco and its general identity.
I think it's coming at an important time as well. If all the pieces in this Ferrari puzzle are coming together, then for Leclerc to get back into winning ways is definitely a good time to do so. We saw at the start of the season, Sainz sort of started to have the edge, but Leclerc soon put it back right, and he's on a really good form, and he's putting together, I think, a really solid season, and he's obviously at the moment the closest challenger to Verstappen.
Exactly, a world championship battle. Just that little hint that one could develop. Maybe a bit optimistic, but maybe that's what we always want to see, a close fight at the front.
Well, he's absolutely ready, isn't he? If it is the case, he's absolutely ready to fight for the title, and a weekend like this proves exactly that.
Yeah, and I would say, like, one of my thoughts, I can't help but feel like, there's just a hint of one there. And the comparison I draw is, this same stage a couple of years ago, which is when we, last really had ideas of a fight for the championship, was round 8 in 2022 was when Leclerc had that engine failure in Baku, and that dropped him 34 points, I think, off the lead. And that was the point, really, you thought it was done, because the trajectory of the season was going away from Leclerc and towards Verstappen. The lead was over 30 points. And yeah, it just had that feeling about it. Well, now, with this win from Leclerc, he's 31 points behind, so he's actually closer than he was a couple of years ago. And crucially, like, that trajectory is different. Ferrari's in the ascendancy. Red Bull's not falling off a cliff by any means, but I don't know. If the Drivers' Championship is out the window, I certainly don't think the Constructors' Championship is. I think Red Bull's got a fight in its hand, actually, to try and retain that one.
Absolutely. As I like to say, the race is on. Josh, let's move on to McLaren now, because it was right in the mix. Oscar Piastri led the line, pretty happy with second. Was this a missed opportunity for him, though?
Potentially, if you put his best sectors together in qualifying, he gets pole position, but it's a bit of a game of if buts and maybes when you're doing that. So I think missed opportunity would be harsh. I think he did a good job. He did a better job than Norris over the course of the weekend, you could say, but everything's so defined by qualifying. It's not exactly a decisive advantage, but he did the job when it mattered in qualifying, and I thought did well in second. There was really no way I think he could have won that race after qualifying.
Yeah, that was a big question. He could have maybe snuck it on pole. It's theoretical that if you put the three sectors together, it was a bit quicker, so you just wonder, it's asking a bit too much, but maybe Scott with a perfect weekend, that could have been a Piastri win, but still, he outperformed Norris. Strong weekend, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I think even if, like the theoretical laps are obviously based on the theoretical sectors, but my guess is that every single driver, if you, especially on the streets of Monaco, if you ran back their qualifying laps, you'd be able to find little bits in each sector where they'd be able to find time. And the main thing I think for Piastri is that his season, which has been impressive and has been getting more impressive as it's gone on, now has like a big headline result to shout about, because I couldn't believe he hadn't been on the podium yet this year, because obviously Norris has not only won a race, but he's just sort of been consistently very, very strong in landing big results. But now Piastri has one of his own as well, so I think he could go from strength to strength from this. It's one of those where the race doesn't banish any questions about how's his time management versus Norris, and can he beat Norris in a straight fight because of the way that Monaco is. But he earned that result through his sheer speed and the way he drove on Saturday. Then he didn't put a foot wrong in the Grand Prix. So I'm glad that he's got a result like this, because his form has definitely deserved it. He's lost results like this in the last couple of races through absolutely no fault of his own. Yeah,
and it's worth noting he had a bit of damage in the race as well. A couple of tenths, quarter of a second maybe from that floor damage. So that didn't make life easy for him on the Sunday. Well, let's move a little bit further down now, Mark. Mercedes had probably its most competitive weekend of the season, although George Russell 5th and Lewis Hamilton 7th matched their results in the Bahrain season opener. So is there a bit to celebrate for them?
Just the specific nature of Monaco makes you a little bit reluctant to go for gold on that. But it looks, compared to a few races earlier, if you put Imola together with this one, it's sort of, there might be something there. Certainly both drivers were saying the balance and the ride was way better than any Merc has been in the last couple of years around here. Still not the cutting edge of speed. I think the positions were flattered in practice a little bit by different programs everyone was running. But not too bad. It was good enough for Russell to out-qualify Verstappen having a very bad day. and Russell having a good day. It was, about the same on qualifying pace. So, yeah, not bad, but they're still sort of a little bit in no man's land. They're well clear of anybody else, given Aston Martin's quite spectacular drop-off in the last couple of races, but they're still noticeably behind the top three.
Classic bit of Russell needing to be reined in a little bit in the first part of the race as well, wasn't it? Where he was like really pushing in that stint after the cars in front, and was basically told there's nothing to be gained by driving at this pace. And then he was sort of trying to complain a little bit, we were going to give away a free pit stop, and kept being told basically your race is not with them, stop trying to make it with them.
Yeah, which I think was fairly reasonable in that case. I must admit, I think it's quite good to see Mercedes just making steady progress. Nothing miraculous, no quick fixes, just keep building on what they've got, because that's something they've been lacking for a few years. So sort of gently encouraging, I think I'll put this one down. Scott, I think we need to consider having a Yuki Tsunoda as doing well corner feature, given we keep talking about this. Qualified and finished 8th. Think he left anything on the table?
I don't think so. I think it's another really good weekend in what is, like, I would say is now F1's 5th fastest car. I don't see any evidence to suggest the Aston is quicker than the RB anymore. I think Tsunoda's driving with the confidence of someone who is just fully on top of things in that team, with that car, with himself as well. He is so consistent at the moment in terms of getting the most out of the car in qualifying and getting up into the top 10, to the point where you're almost disappointed when he ends up 8th or 9th in qualifying, because you've just seen little bits through the weekend where he's basically overperforming where the car should be, because he's nailing it on a quali sim in FP2 or FP3 or whatever. So that puts him 4th or 5th or something like that. And then he qualifies 8th or 9th, and you think, oh, but could he have been 6th? And no, it's just that is better than when the car where the car should be. I think he's doing a fantastic job at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. He had a very quiet race ultimately, because although he had Albon behind him all the way, he dropped off the back of that little group of Mercedes and Verstappen in it. So relatively straightforward race. But yeah, it's great to be able to talk about Tsunoda in terms of consistency. I'm so pleased to see that.
Absolutely. Although he didn't endear himself to Albon with the amount of pace management he was doing in the race. Have you had a chance to see what Albon had to say afterwards?
I haven't as yet. I presume he felt it was a little bit pedestrian, therefore.
He thought it was a bit excessive, but not in like a particularly like overly irate way, because I don't think Albon does that. But basically, over the course of this, I don't know how long the answer was. Let's say a 60, 70-second answer. There are at least 3 occasions where Albon attempted to stop himself and move on, and then went back to how ridiculous Yuki's excessive pace management was. Albon says at one point he felt that he could have got out, hopped on his Vespa and gone quicker.
Well, that's what Monaco's often all about, and certainly it did the job for RB. We should talk about Williams, though, a bit, Josh, because finally it broke its 2024 point stack. Alex Albon starting and finishing 9th, so very similar to Tsunoda, really, but just one place behind. How impressed were you with Albon and Williams?
Yeah, huge relief for Williams to finally get a point on the board, or 2 points in this case. Monaco is obviously the track that means their weight disadvantage is kind of at its least. Somewhere like Monza is obviously going to be the most kind of painful circuit for them. So that kind of hid a bit of their limitation, and obviously coupled with Albon doing a really good qualifying lap and just generally driving really well throughout the weekend, he was obviously able to snag a couple of points. So yeah, really impressed with Albon and Williams, and yeah, it doesn't feel like this is some kind of step forward for them or real improvement, but just simply a set of circumstances which they were able to take advantage of in a way that they haven't been able to do with this more sort of standard, less peaky car.
It does at least prove what they've been saying about the fact if things go right and they have a favourable weekend, then points really are on the board now. But let's talk about one of the big talking points, and we know it's a big talking point because we had loads of questions from the Race Members Club, because Pierre Gasly bagged his first point of the season. Unusually good weekend for Alpine, but it was that first lap collision at Poitiers with Ocon. We'll do a little mini questions section here. We're taking our cue from one of our members who simply sent in the question, Esteban Ocon, discuss, which I thought was a pretty good way of putting it, which came from TJM Preston. But to get into a bit more detail, Scott, this question from Jack Aitken. namesake of a former team reserve driver for the Enstone team. He says, very rarely are penalties awarded for incidents between teammates. What was different about Esteban Ocon's lunge on Pierre Gasly?
Yeah, I did wonder that when it happened. I also thought as well that while it's normally applied to turn one, the first lap leniency really is a first lap thing. It isn't normally just the first corner, or in the case of Sergio Perez versus Kevin Magnussen, the run out of the first corner. So those are a couple of points that I felt this kind of deviated from the norm on, really. So I can only assume that they felt that the move was so egregious that it just merited punishment. Ocon obviously came from quite a way back into a not impossible overtaking spot. There are no conventional overtaking places in Monaco. You do have to get a bit opportunistic and improvise. I would say that Ocon was massively testing the definition of improvisation with that move. The thing that annoyed me about it was that I feel like he actually did a really good job of getting about 80% of the move done, and then he just seemed to be a little bit greedy mid to exit and didn't leave Gasly any space. And so my guess is that he just very simply fell foul of the racing guidelines, which are that you have to leave space on the exit, and he didn't do that because he was feeding Gasly into the wall on the outside, and that is why they made contact.
Yeah, it didn't seem it wasn't a ridiculous lunge in itself. I think within the Alpine context, obviously that was significant, and there do appear to have been some conversations about, just don't do that, which I think is why Gasly was so annoyed. Maybe there was an opportunity for Gasly could have just found a way to back out even more and stop it. But yeah, you understand why he was annoyed with Ocon. But Mark, there's a question from Liam Scully who says, what do you think Bruno Famin meant when he talked about consequences for Esteban Ocon? Could that be confirmation that he'll be replaced next season? And if so, who will it be?
It could be that. He could be talking about something more immediate. And, I wonder if he's thinking about resting him for a race or two. And I think if it was the latter, then the obvious candidate would be Jack Doohan, the reserve driver, who is one of the possibilities for next year as well in that seat. So wait and see, I guess. But he wouldn't. Famin wouldn't have said that if he didn't have some sort of plan.
It seems like that Ocon-Alpine relationship isn't going to last very long if this is just a kind of another factor onto that, which already seemed like it was going to end. It
doesn't feel like much of a consequence. If the consequence is that Ocon's off at the end of the year anyway, I don't think that'll be it, because Ocon's off at the end of the year anyway. So it's not really much of a consequence to just confirm the exit that everybody and Ocon is expecting.
And when he says we have a very difficult decision to face, that doesn't sound like next year.
No.
Yeah, it certainly seems to be some kind of implied threat there. There was some footage of Bruno Famin talking to Jack Doohan after the race, and speculation that could be talking about being in for Canada. But, of course, team boss speaks to reserve driver after race. Just as a fact, is not necessarily that significant. So, for all we know, he's maybe asking Doohan for some holiday tips for going to Australia or something. So, we'll see what happens there.
Doohan had been busy in the sim as well, hadn't he, on Friday night? And I think he'd been in Enstone and worked on the simulator there, helped turn around there Friday and helped deliver that qualifying result.
Maybe Doohan was talking to Famin. Did anybody consider it that way round? Maybe Doohan was saying to him, I busted my backside on Friday night. I toiled and toiled and toiled. And this is what your drivers then do for all of my hard work. You need to sort this out, Bruno.
He's probably just following him around saying, do you know what I'd have been doing in that race? Not launching that move at Portier, definitely not doing that. But this is part of that wider thing. That team has sort of moved towards Gasly gradually, and even before this weekend it was clear as perhaps stretching it, but it seemed that Ocon's heading towards the exit door. So, yeah, part of that general trajectory. And maybe it would suit them to give Doohan a go, because he's definitely in contention for that seat next year if Ocon is dropped. Now, Josh, we didn't go here after Imola, but generally we have this season. Would you like to have the first chance to lead us to one of our favourite places?
Yes, I'd love to. Let's go to Valtteri Bottas' Sympathy Corner.
Welcome to Valtteri Bottas Sympathy Corner.
Josh, why are we here?
Well, we're here because there was clearly one, by far and away the weakest team of the Monaco weekend was Sauber. As I mentioned, we went trackside and the laziest car through many of the corners. The car where the drivers clearly didn't have all that much confidence throughout the whole weekend was the Sauber. So it was a bit of a mess. The drivers and the team didn't particularly know why, but they were just so visibly far off. And with the field being so close, they just stuck out like a sore thumb at the bottom of the timing screen in more or less every session. Obviously, the race wasn't as bad, but as I was speaking to the team after the race, that was mainly because everybody was pace managing ahead. So while the others were driving very slowly, the Saubers were driving as fast as they could, but they were obviously caught in that DRS train. So yeah, miserable weekend and no real answers. They think Monaco will be a bit of a one-off, but it's still clearly a bit of a weakness with their car, which could still crop up elsewhere. So yeah, we'll have to see, but plenty of head scratching to go for Sauber, probably, I mean, even more so than Red Bull, obviously, because at least Red Bull still have a race-winning car.
Yeah, and to make matters worse for Sauber, I think they've now moved to 10th place and bottom behind Alpine in our Super Times performance tracker for the season, and they were pretty horrible at Imola as well, the Saubers. So yeah, there's some work to be done there. We should very, very briefly, actually, Scott, mention the Aston Martins because, well, they weren't really worthy of much mention because that car is just getting increasingly midfield in the bad sense of the word, isn't it?
Yeah, as I said earlier, I see no evidence to suggest the Aston is quicker than the RB, so I think it's the sixth fastest car now. And it looked like that. I mean, at times in the weekend it looked better, but Alonso and Stroll think that they were just flattered earlier in the weekend. And in this particular Grand Prix, they played it as well as they could, with Alonso basically being Stroll's rear gunner, backing up the cars behind so that Stroll could get rid of the medium tyres that him and Alonso had to take on at the restart because they started the Grand Prix on hards. Stroll did that, and then he basically had the chance to sort of go out and maybe try and nick the final point off of Gasly or whatever, but never came to pass because Stroll quite carelessly clipped the barrier with his inside rear wheel at the chicane exit in the tunnel. And then Alonso, this genuinely amused me, although I wasn't really sure how he found himself in this position, if he's being honest. Alonso then inherited what he thought was 10th place. And he claims that he spent that entire time being Stroll's rear gunner doing it because they were going for 10th and that they were protecting 10th for Stroll. And then Alonso then thought, when Stroll dropped off, Alonso thought he had then inherited the final points position. So he said on these really old mediums that he's done the whole race on, he was like, okay, it's all on me now to get this final point. And he didn't say when he realised, but he said he'd done about 50 laps of the Grand Prix thinking they were fighting for 10th place and a point. And if that's true, if that wasn't just a little bit of embellishment, I would have hated to have been the person that did eventually tell him.
Yeah, having spent a big chunk of the race just with a queue of cars behind you, yeah, that would have felt rather frustrating. But yeah, the fact that they're worried about missing out on a single point tells you quite a lot about where Aston Martin have fallen to, and they seem to be behind RB now. Right, well, as ever, we'll take questions from the Race Members Club for the final part of our podcast. Thanks to everyone who sent questions in. If you'd like to know a little bit more about the Race Members Club, click the link in the description for this episode. Head to our website and click on Go Ad-Free. All sorts of benefits there. Question asking privileges, the ad-free environment on the website, and of course, special bonus podcasts. And we'll try and get through as many of these questions as we can now and then in subsequent podcasts before Canada. So, Scott, first for you. Question from Ian Hanley. How on earth has Ocon got a penalty, yet that absolutely ridiculous move by Kevin Magnussen gets nothing and there was no gap? The move was never on and he took himself and two competitors out.
Well, I think they do it different because Ocon's was a lunge from behind. There was a gap to go into, but he definitely inserted the Alpine into that gap from afar. The Magnussen one was quite simple. He got a better run than Perez off the corner, and the way that snaking run up the hill works, that there are places that you can position your car where there's space that very quickly isn't space, because if you keep going a straight line you're going to hit a barrier. At the point in which Magnussen moved to the right of Perez, there was a gap. It was always likely to close. In fact, it was always going to close, and it was a pretty reckless move for Magnussen to make, but there was a gap there. That's why he was able to get a wheel on the inside of Perez as well. But then Perez moves across, And I think even though he was suggesting, on his onboard you can see, you never see Magnussen's car, he knew Magnussen was there. So he's conscious of that, and he's moved across probably because he thinks Magnussen's going to back out. The track comes to Perez, not Magnussen, but Magnussen's still there. Perez isn't yielding at all. So it's not 6 to 1, half a dozen to the other. It's probably more Magnussen's fault as a whole. But it's happened just on the exit of turn 1 because of the nature of the cars vying for position through a winding part of track. And it's just it's enough of a racing incident for them to just go, that's just first lap chaos.
I think that's it. I think there was an innocent party in the Gasly-Ocon one, whereas I think there's a blame to take for both drivers in the other one.
Yeah, it was just a bit needless, wasn't it? There were opportunities for both of them to prevent that one from happening. Josh, a question from John O'Hara. If Carlos Sainz is allowed to restart from third place, shouldn't this have been a full restart and therefore a tyre change should have been required? It seems a bit inconsistent to me.
Yeah, it was mainly because Zhou Guanyu was caught up behind all of the crashed cars. If you saw his onboard, he was very harsh on the brakes and trying to avoid the absolute litany of debris that was all across the track. So a full restart just made sense, and unfortunately the tyre rule change was just the worst place to have it was in Monaco, and that kind of killed the race. But you wouldn't have seen that at any other circuit because there are very, very few others where people could have done the full race on one set of tyres. So I think a slightly unfortunate one there.
Yeah, you basically have to boil that down to there's a difference between a standing restart, because it's not a race restart, it's just that is how you restart races. It's a standing restart. It's been the case for a few years now. You can have a safety car restart, but it's mostly a standing restart. And the original grid order was just the most reliable way the FIA decided was the most accurate way to set the grid for that restart. So it wasn't a full restart of the race that then in that sense, it was a standing restart with the starting order starting order based on the start of the Grand Prix itself. They're two slightly different things.
It was the position as they went past the safety car 1 line.
Yeah.
So it was slightly different to the original grid, but basically the same.
Yeah, and had Joe got further round before the red flag, then that would have triggered it to the next point, and you'd had a sector 1 times, and that would have changed it. So probably Carlos Sainz owes a quick thank you to Joe for that one. Sean Lehan says, hi guys, excellent analysis and insight as always. A question referencing Mark's excellent analysis of the Red Bull suspension limitations. Do their problems getting the car to work this weekend and previously in Singapore give sufficient clues to other teams as to where the Red Bull is so successful as a ground effect concept?
Well, I think Red Bull's two rivals, McLaren and Ferrari, are deep into their own development curve now, and reaping the rewards for understanding their own cars. And yeah, they've taken quite a few cues from last year's Red Bull and that of the year before, but it's still not. They're not exactly the same in the way that they're the balance between the mechanical and the aerodynamics at the rear. But as we touched on before, I think certainly it seems that there are some very key limitations to that. So maybe Ferrari and McLaren wouldn't want to follow that. Maybe they would prefer to just keep going with their own. There's only one more year of this regulation set to go, so you're starting again. Probably wouldn't reap the reward. So I don't think so. I think it's generally understood how the car works, and I think that it's converging on its own, and the Red Bull developers, as Adrian said at the launch, does seem to be tailing off a little.
And a connected question I'll take from Kieran Bruce, who says, how much of a test is it for Red Bull to develop the current issues out of the car without, I'm guessing, Adrian Newey's input? Well, they do still have some Newey input. He was there in the garage during the weekend. But ultimately, Newey has been part of conceiving the car, a key part of conceiving the car that does have that problem. So, yeah, it's a big test for Red Bull to develop it out of the car. And if it has to wait for RB21, which is very likely to change it given some of the decisions they've made, then it will be without Newey's input. But I don't think with or without Newey's input is a huge difference maker when it comes to this. I think it'll be interesting to see whether they do have to carry it through to the end of next season or not. But yeah, I think they've probably got equal chance with or without Adrian Newey on this particular one. Scott, a question from Matthew Clegg, who says, what was it about this weekend that meant the Williams with Alex Albon got into Q3? Was it circuit characteristics or others around them simply not maximising their weekend?
That's a good question. I think there were elements of obviously underachievement elsewhere. I think obviously the Red Bull of Sergio Perez was out of the picture. Should have been another car inside the top 10. That could quite conceivably have eliminated Albon in Q2, because while he qualified P9, I think he only got into Q3 in 10th. So he was right on the cusp. Then there were elements of, at least one of the Hasses felt that they could have been in Q3 if they'd hooked everything up. So there's a little bit of that. But I also think it's reward for Williams just chipping away at him, starting to add a bit of performance to this car that conceptually is better than last year, but has just started the year underdeveloped and overweight. And, they had an upgrade at Imola that took some weight out of the car and added some performance to the car. I think Albon had a new rear wing here, and Sargent was on the 23 spec. So, they're just improving, and they weren't a million miles away before. They were in that kind of sort of 12th to 15th region. But this is a circuit, that rewards a car that a driver can push with, and that is something, at least in certain conditions, Albon has been happy with this year. It's just that it hasn't quite had that overall peak performance. It had just enough peak performance here and enough usability, and a driver who was really able to wring its neck through qualifying. Albon banked that grid position and made the most of it, because this race was entirely down to where you started.
Question for you, Josh, from Paul Balkazak, who says, why did the second formation lap count as a race lap?
I believe that's because the cars are fueled up for 78 laps plus a formation lap, so it just makes sense to count that as a racing lap.
Yeah, I think the simple answer is it wasn't a formation lap, ultimately. As you say, Mark, a question from John Foggin, who says, why did it take so long for Mercedes to pit Lewis for new tyres when there was a huge gap to Tsunoda for ages before it happened? He could have stopped and got the undercut on Verstappen potentially at least 10 laps earlier, giving him more time to catch and pass those ahead.
He could have done, but they were very carefully playing on the cusp of tyre graining. And not just Mercedes, but certainly Mercedes was suffering from it in the long runs on Friday, but running at a considerably faster pace than they run the race at. I think they were doing 15s on the long runs on Friday and running 18s and 19s in the race today. So at a harder pace, the limitation was front tyre graining, so they wanted to do the undercut, but in a way that didn't make the stint too long, especially as he would have had to have pushed hard on that outlap to make it work.
The next question from Miles Dick, which I'll take, says, why wouldn't Hamilton have known he needed a faster outlap after his pit stop to deny Verstappen a free stop? Surely the Red Bull pit crew coming out to make Hamilton's pit entry difficult would have been a big hint. Did Hamilton drive a slow outlap on purpose because he was unhappy with the Mercedes strategy? I think it's just they didn't tell him, ultimately. Toto Wolff admitted there was a miscommunication, and while, yes, it's fair to say you could argue it's quite obvious, perhaps, but teams will get irritated when drivers don't listen to the instructions they're given, and usually if your outlap's critical you'll be told. And of course, as we've talked about before, the way you go on the tyres when there's the maximum tread on it can influence the way the tyres last and perform as well. So he was probably just doing a normal outlap. Yeah, maybe he could have attacked a little bit more, but yeah, they needed to give him that critical message. That's what it's there for, and he probably assumed they had their reasons for it because they could see the whole race. Scott, a question from Lachlan Babbage. Can we still consider the Monaco Grand Prix a part of the Triple Crown? I think a race that can be won by just qualifying shouldn't really count. Can you think of any other major races that should take its place? I'm thinking of the Nürburgring 24 Hours as something I'd like to see recognised as part of the crown.
No, because it needs to be a Formula One race, because it needs to be something that alongside Indy and Le Mans is borderline impossible to win. That's what makes it this mythical thing. It's what makes it so cool that Alonso made a conscious effort to go for it and missed it. Like, that's how hard it is. Alonso had one of them in the bag already, went and then one of the other ones twice with ease, and couldn't get the third one, and probably never will get the third one. I'm happy with it still being Monaco, because it's a race steeped in tradition, and there'll only be a certain number of people that can ever have a crack at it, and the crossover of the people who will have a crack at winning Monaco and then doing the others is even lower. So I'm happy with where it is. I like it. I mean, like Nürburgring 24, for example, is a good one from a historic point of view and stuff like that. But it doesn't. It doesn't have that same allure.
Yeah, we should note, technically speaking, when Graham Hill coined the Triple Crown, he included the World Championship, not Monaco, although Monaco tends to be the more conventional one. It's a bit more consistent. And, of course, the Triple Crown is quite a nebulous sort of concept. It's quite fun, but it only really became a thing again when Alonso tried to do it. Josh, a question from Nathan Schwartz, who says, I'm curious, you often hear Indy aficionados say that the 500 is more important than the IndyCar Championship. Same thing for Le Mans and the WEC title. I know Monaco is the third jewel in the Triple Crown, yet it doesn't feel like drivers value it as much as a Drivers' Championship, and I'm curious why you think that is compared to the other two.
It's just a different setup to Le Mans and the Indy 500. You know, it's the 500 with the championship wrapped around it, and it's Le Mans with a endurance championship wrapped around it. But Monaco has been for a very, very long time, obviously just one round within a Drivers' Championship. So I think that's the main difference, that F1 itself as a series is a lot bigger compared to IndyCar and WEC as standalone series. So it would be very, very hard for one F1 race to ever be as big as the championship. I think that's the main difference, whereas you can easily see why the 24 Hours of Le Mans and the Indy 500 are kind of almost bigger than their respective championships.
Question for you now, Mark, from Paul Hodgen, and John Berger actually asked a similar question. Why is Lewis Hamilton saying he will not be able to beat George Russell when it comes to qualifying? Surely this is just Lewis giving himself a get-out-of-jail-free card because he knows George has got his number this year with qualifying. And what does this do to the relationship between him and George?
It's been an odd pattern, isn't it? It's developed, you know, they hit the ground running on Friday, and Lewis is invariably the quicker of the two. And it goes all the way through to practice, and then you get to qualifying, and it stalls for Lewis, and George is usually the quicker qualifying driver. And it's, you know, any racing driver, when something odd like that is happening, will get a bit paranoid. And I think that's all it is. There's a little bit of competitive paranoia creeping in, thinking, is this to do with me leaving the team at the end of the year? What's going on? And you grab the guy straight out of the car in qualifying, and it's happened again, and it's come out. But I don't necessarily think it's there's anything to it. But I think it's quite understandable, the questions there in his head.
Lewis did kind of partially row back on it after the race, because I asked him. I did say, like, he'd made this comment, and, you know, what did you mean by that? Because he said that he now always goes into qualifying knowing he'll lose a couple of attempts. So I said to him, because you could have interpreted that a couple of ways after quali yesterday, and so I just said, do you mean to George, or do you mean to the others? You know, the relative pace, because one has an implication that the other doesn't. Yeah. And he kind of sort of skirted around it and just went, oh, he's just trying to focus now and, like, doing his best, and he knows he just puts as much effort in as he can. And it felt a little bit like he kind of knows he either knew what he was implying, or he knows how it's come across and how it's and in reality probably understands the ramifications of that kind of implication. And I got the impression he wasn't as fully committed to the idea as some people interpreted it as him being afterwards on Saturday.
Question now from John Ayers. With the exception of Miami in recent times, we see very limited first corner banzai attempts as much as we used to. Often the leaders are very discreet and drive off in grid order. Is this to do with starting times now being very equal in modern F1 cars, or a change in the modern drivers' behaviours? Yeah, I think it is down to the fact that the range of potential outcomes of starts is much narrower now. Everyone has a similar degree of start. Their brakes are generally in a similar sort of place. There's just fewer offsets, and I think drivers also are fairly cautious not to pick up needless damage as well in the first corners we saw in Miami, how wrong it can get. So yeah, I think it's just a convergence of start performance means there's fewer opportunities. Scott, we've got a few questions about the Monaco format we can rattle through. Nevin Knowles says the Monaco race weekend needs to change. I don't think the race can be fixed, so it should be adjusted from a traditional weekend to super qualifying. Traditional Q1 to Q3 and the top 10 do a one-lap shootout the next day, with P10 going first and P1 going last. Each driver has 2 minutes to start their lap. They could alter the points, but the best part of the weekend is qualifying, and the race is just a formality.
I admire the thought that's gone into it. I just wouldn't like to see any Formula One race boiled down to just being the sort of time trial element of it. I like that Monaco puts emphasis on that other races perhaps don't. That makes it unique in a sense. But also, this was by no means a classic. It was one of the worst races I've watched in terms of having something to look out for and you're waiting for something to happen. But one of the beauties of Monaco is that something can happen at any time, and I like a track that brings its own jeopardy. You know, one of the things that's great about here is that how many times have we seen it being impacted by weather over the years? But it's not just, you know, at the mercy of the weather in the region on a given day. There are elements of the circuit as well. The fact that it demands so much attention and that the barriers are so close, there could be a safety car at any moment. It keeps you on your toes, Monaco, until the very end as a driver. And while it's easy for some, I don't think it's easy for everybody. And yeah, I don't mind it. I think it does. I do accept the point that it brings so much else over the rest of the weekend, and especially qualifying. Maybe it's worth sitting through a few of these every now and again. I'd like there to be something different, but I'd like it to still remain an actual Grand Prix in terms of there being a race.
Josh Stephen Rucco asks, should F1 change the rule to one mandatory pit stop instead of running 2 compounds of tyres? Stephen also mentions this would solve the red flag tyre change issue.
It's a good suggestion. I guess you'd have the problem at the other end of the race. If there was a red flag and somebody had been running on the same set of tyres, they're then penalised for doing so because they changed their tyres into the red flag. They haven't obviously done their mandatory pit stop. So it's sort of solving one problem, but then you're potentially creating another. So I think it kind of shows how complex an issue that one is to solve.
Mark, a question for you from Gordon Ross. Is it time to introduce the must-use all 3 tyre compounds rule for Monaco only?
Yeah, probably some merit in that. It just gets you out of the stalemate. Another alternative is to just bring special softer compound tyres. The softest 3 compounds that Pirelli have that they bring, but maybe they need to be a little bit softer for this one. But yeah, another way of doing it would be to insist on the all 3 compounds. So yeah, very valid point.
A few drivers actually mentioned that after the race. They said that they just felt that the medium and the hard were really similar tyres for starters. You saw that actually in the most extreme sense today, I suppose, with the fact that you could use both sets for the entire Grand Prix distance. Yeah. So yeah, softer tyres I think would be a great way to go.
That does feed into the next question from Ansi Rolamo, who says, why can't you have special tyres for Monaco that only last for 15 to 20 laps? All the special rules mandating at least 3 stops. Well, the special tyres, I think the main reason there won't be is there's a cost concern, and there would still be loads of management within that as well. How slow can you go without being overtaken? Pretty slowly, as it turns out. So yeah, but I think that'll be the main reason they want to keep it within the 5 available compounds that they tried to do the season on, and that's mainly financial. Scott, Sean Murphy says, after another Monaco procession, do you think it would make any difference if the Nouvelle chicane was removed to allow a straight run from Poitiers to Tabac? Would an overtake into Tabac even be feasible in that scenario?
No, I don't think it would. I actually had that thought during the Grand Prix. There was a point where you just saw that the run now just feels like that run from Poitiers down to the chicane just gets shorter and shorter. Mm-hmm. Like it's just, and I think I said earlier, I know why it can't, but I just quite like that run through the tunnel to be a DRS zone. Like it'd just be quite cool. Probably be a death trap, to be honest. But no, if you just run all the way down to back, you'd never have a move there. It just wouldn't. It would make it more of a braking zone, but not enough.
And I think if you did do that I don't think I'd like to be in the Tabac grandstand on the outside there, because I think that would be a bit of a safety concern. And the final question mark from Francis Cheer, who says, I've been following F1 since the mid-1970s. We're on the 46th lap of the 2024 Monaco race. I don't think I've seen a more ridiculous race than this one. Surely we can mandate something like quadruple pit stops, whatever it takes to make this race somehow less stupid. I want to see F1 in Monaco, but something needs to be done. Your views on mandating something silly like quad pit stops, please. Have you got an extreme solution to Monaco, Mark?
So rain sprinklers, random, it's a knockout type penalties, just given at random to different drivers. I don't know. Really, it's just a very, very narrow confined track combined with very wide, very fast cars. And it was considered very narrow when the first Grand Prix ran here in 1929, and that was with Bugatti Type 35s, which are about probably not much more than half the width of a current car. So there you go.
Alonso was asked today if he'd like to see Joker lap in Monaco. You can imagine how well that suggestion went down.
I've got to say, I really like the Monaco Grand Prix, and look for ways to improve it, but we should never underestimate the majesty of what these drivers do. Even when they're driving around at reduced pace in the Grand Prix, it's incredible. In qualifying, even more so. And I think Monaco's a unique challenge we shouldn't take for granted. But anyway, thanks very much to Scott, Josh and Mark. Head to therace.com. Loads to read there. Listen to our other podcasts, including Bring Back V10s, and check out our YouTube channel as well. If you enjoy this podcast as well, leave us a review on your podcast platform of choice, because that's really helpful for us. And we've got a 2-week gap now to the Canadian Grand Prix, but stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.